Hey, welcome back to the History Argument. Today, we are going to be talking about what was the Somme.
I'm the Brigadier General.
And I'm the Raving.
All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about was the purpose of the attack over the Somme. So the main purpose of the attack, the main objective, was to relieve the desperate defenders of Verdun. After the unsuccessful attack at Verdun, the French were in a very desperate position, and the Germans were beginning to make headway. So the Allies needed to push the Germans back and distract them somewhere else due to Verdun's incredible strategic value. So the purpose of the attack, the secondary purpose, was to break through the German lines and liberate the areas of France and Belgium that were taken during the first German attacks of the war. Anything else to add?
Yeah, so the plan was developed mainly by British General Douglas Haig, who really wanted to take German pressure away, not just from Verdun, but from the entire more southerly front, and to devote more forces to what could possibly end up being a breakthrough that could change the course of the war. And obviously that didn't happen.
Yeah, so moving on, we need to talk about the Allied plan. So the original plan was to bombard the German positions for a week prior to the attack with 1,400 Allied guns. And when doing this, they used up almost 1.7 million shells, many of which were faulty and failed to explode on impact and were mainly ineffective. The ones that did explode were mainly ineffective due to the German bunkers that protected personnel and equipment. The second part of the plan was to send the British Third Army around the north to divert the German divisions so that they wouldn't be able to respond effectively to the 16 infantry divisions that were to attack in the center and take control of their trenches. Here is an image of the original objectives that the British had for their first day of attack. As you can see, they're very ambitious, some of them penetrating the first line of German trenches.
Yeah, now the British objectives here were really to have an attack, a very large-scale attack over a long area of land. It's all near the Somme River valley, which is pretty important for its terrain, and it's essentially a gateway to not only France but to the sea. And so they wanted to have a attack that was large enough for the Germans to really take notice and force their hand into counterattacking and devoting more and more troops to it. However, the British made severe miscalculations, in some cases overreaching, and in some cases just not assessing what they could do and the usefulness of their equipment. Like you already said, the many of the shells that were fired simply didn't go off for multiple reasons, say malfunctions, damage when they were being transported from Britain, and other things. And sometimes even they would land and it'd be wet and they'd be defused. I mean, there were many reasons for this, but the fact of the matter was that the artillery barrages were not as effective as the British wanted them to be, but they attacked as if they had been.
Yeah. All right, so the next thing we want to look at is the Allied reality versus their original plan. So many of the troops that they were going to be sending over the top into the German trenches were green recruits that hadn't seen battle. And they were mainly made up of the PALS battalions and the enthusiastic volunteers of late 1914 that had just finished their training and managed to get over to Europe for the first time. As I said earlier, many of them had not seen combat. And the final thing was that the artillery bombardment was far less successful than expected. They didn't destroy as much barbed wire, which allowed British troops to clump up, and they did not face the Germans in the least bit because of their deep bunkers to protect their troops and their equipment.
Yes, now this is early 1916. The British, who had a small but professionally trained army, had been successful in the early war. As this is in 1916, the Somme is a new offensive. Any professional career soldiers who had joined the war in 1914 when the British initially entered were either dead, unable to serve, or were devoted to other areas of the war. The Somme was a brand new offensive. Now, the Pals battalions, who, as you said, signed up very enthusiastically. There was this sense of patriotism and duty in Great Britain. They had no idea what they were facing. And indeed, most of the generals and many of the general populace of the world had no idea what this war was going to be like. And really, it was a shock to many of the troops when they came onto the Somme just how brutal and frankly dishonorable this war was. I mean, wars in the past had been sort of glorified, and this was nothing like it. It became essentially the ultimate factory of death. And these troops, who had never seen combat, let alone combat like this, really couldn't face up to what they were doing. They fought bravely nonetheless, but no one could have prepared them for what they were going to face in the Somme.
Yeah, and so this is a picture of a British Pals battalion marching to the Somme. They look very happy, very enthusiastic. And when we talk about British Pals battalions, this was a British initiative to, instead of randomly pairing people up into their regiments and division, they would create these battalions of people from the same area, neighborhood, and part of Britain, so that they'd have something in common, something to talk about. And many of these people could even be from the same block or from the same town. And so the idea was that they would be more willing to fight, and they would be less likely to desert if they were fighting with their friends and for their friends. And that was what a Pals battalion was.
Now, the Pals battalions, they were discontinued directly after the Somme. Of entire towns literally dying in Europe. So after the war, they had nobody to come back and say take up jobs again or feed their family. So Pals battalions were discontinued because the idea of an entire town. So not only if you are someone back home, your father or your husband going out and dying, but same thing was happening to all of your friends and all of your family in that town. So entire towns were being wiped out on the Somme, and as a result of that, the British stopped the initiative, which was, while well-intentioned, it did not account for the scale of death that would happen in the war.
Yeah, so this is a Pals battalion marching to the Somme, and this is them after. They look much less cheery in this image. Yes, so now we have to look at the German defense. The German defense was made up of 3 lines of trenches. The 2 main lines of trenches, and a third one was under construction, not yet in commission. And so there were 3 lines of trenches in each main line. One was a firing line, one was a support trench, and one was a reserve trench. So the firing trench would have your machine guns and your main body of frontline troops ready to repel attacks, ready to repel large-scale attacks and launch attacks of their own. The support trench would be able to send troops up to the firing trench or become the new firing trench if the firing trench were compromised. And the reserve trench was for rest and recuperation and for like the mess hall, and just the third line of trench was much more less dangerous and more chill. And all of these trenches would be connected by communications trenches and supply trenches, so that if one part of the trench was compromised, you could still get troops up to another part.
Yes. Now, these trenches worked in similar ways on both sides, but notable differences were British firing trenches often were deeper, and they were where most of the troops slept. They didn't really have a lot of rotation, as pretty much all of their troops were devoted to the front. And similar things on the German lines, but to a lesser extent. The Germans were able to make a better use of their reserve trenches and stuff like that than the British were. And this is purely by virtue of which the British were obviously using newer troops, not accustomed to this way of fighting, and they needed every man on this attack that were going to succeed up in the trench. And even after the initial few days proved to be failures, they needed to ensure that everybody could be mobilized immediately rather than being called up from behind.
Yeah. So in the Allied armies, the reserve trench was more of a reward or a place for medics and things like that. So this is an image of a German machine gun dugout. As you can see, they have their gas masks on and their machine gun prepared to fire. So next we have to talk about the German advantage. Many of the troops on the German front were battle-hardened veterans. They had seen many battles across the Belgian campaign and the push into France, while they were enacting the Schlieffen Plan. And they had many bunkers and burrows to protect soldiers and their weapons from the week-long artillery bombardment. So they didn't take many casualties, as the Allies had hoped, during the bombardment, which the operation hinged on. And they had many machine guns prepared to cut down enemy troops.
Yeah, now the Germans in the Battle of the Somme initially had, as you said, seen battle, oftentimes seen quite a lot of battle, which more prepared them better for this sort of warfare. They obviously, no one could really become used to this sort of battle. However, they were better adjusted to the constant shells, the mud, the rats, all of the bad things about trench warfare. And as such, in the very early days, German morale was not terrible. As I mean, obviously, it's never good in World War One. Throughout World War One, you really do not see many happy battalions or groups of people. However, the Germans being better prepared and better morale. But it was a double-edged sword. Many of the Germans in their trenches were tired, and a lot of them were facing some sort of injury or another. And some of them were already facing the initial damaging symptoms of shell shock, now known as PTSD. So many of the Germans, while they were better prepared, some of them were also less prepared for this, as they had already seen so much of the war that they were really tired of it. Now, with on the Allied side, as we already discussed, this was not a problem. However, the Palace battalions and the new troops were not prepared at all for this sort of warfare.
Yeah, so sorry, my finger hit the wrong button. So now I have to talk about the first day of the Somme. So the first day of the Somme is remembered as just an absolute disaster, a slaughter of British troops. And so the British soldiers were absolutely slaughtered by German machine guns due to the ineffectiveness of their artillery bombardment. The Germans were prepared as soon as they started coming over the top, and much of the barbed wire was still left standing. So the British were filing through very small cuts in the barbed wire, and just that proved excellent targets for machine gun fire. And they didn't even get a chance to make it in. Many didn't even get a chance to make it into the German trenches. Eventually, of course, just by pure numbers and luck, they managed to make it into the German trenches, and bloody hand-to-hand combat ensued with the Germans So there were 57,000 British casualties and 12,000 German, and it was the single bloodiest day in British military history. Another large problem with the artillery was that they had set a firing schedule for the artillery to move on every hour or so to a different artillery target so they weren't slaughtering their own troops. But this was a very rigid schedule, and due to them not having reliable field radios, these soldiers were not able to tell the artillery gunmen that they hadn't yet captured their objectives during the first hours. And so the artillery moved on, and soldiers were going in without artillery support, which contributed to much of the slaughter.
Yeah, the first day was a disaster for the British, no matter how you look at it. Obviously, the worst day in their history, but also bad for logistical and strategic reasons. They were still using in 1916. It had been 2 years into the war. They had been fighting this war for 2 years, and generals were now aware that this was not a mobile war. This was a stagnant war, with trench warfare being pretty much the only option on the Western Front. However, they were still using the idea that you could really overwhelm and punch through the Germans' lines, but that really just wasn't the case. They were still trying to use the old tactics, and it proved to be a disaster for them. The Somme is really when things started changing, and people started realizing this really isn't the way. A war cannot be fought this way. We will never win this way. But there weren't many options. The artillery schedules for the British, again, a well-intentioned plan, but it was a disaster because oftentimes, as you said, infantry were going in without proper support. Now, the British had an excellent system of every commander had a watch, and the watch was always on time. However, this is war. Your situations change. And so when people were going over the top, they would lose their artillery support, lose the battle. And later in the battle, as times got even more messed up, you would sometimes have examples of friendly fire, and this would happen on both sides, but where the artillery were firing on their own troops, attempting to advance across the no man's land to take up the opposing trenches.
Yeah. So here's a graphic of the total British and German casualties on the first day. As you can see, the British casualties number far more than the German. So now we have to talk about the scale of the battle. So after the week-long ineffective artillery rebombardment, the massive Allied charge results in heavy casualties for the British, and then 4 months of long, hard fighting eventually results in an Allied pyrrhic victory. And a pyrrhic victory essentially is a winning a strategic objective while essentially destroying your army. There is no victory in a pyrrhic victory, true victory in a pyrrhic victory.
Yeah, now the British really had made a massive miscalculation in this entire offensive. They lost far more troops than they intended to, and led the French to lose many more troops than they intended to on all sides, including the Germans. The losses were staggering. Over 1 million men, and all totaled up, were killed or wounded on the Somme. So it was one of the greatest military disasters in human history, really.
Yeah. So here's just a painting of a Welsh division charging into German trenches in an. This is how a British artist perceived the battle.
Yeah, going back to that image, this is an example of how the war really felt when you were in it. You oftentimes had this sort of really brutal hand-to-hand fighting, and artists after the war would make these works really revealing how horrific it truly was. And the World War I was really the first war where there was no sense of like honor or glory, really revealing what war actually is. So it's a horrible thing where no one really, especially in this war, no one really could claim a true victory.